In a previous video, I demonstrated how to set up working site size from the flat. I have my image taped down. I do have a plumb line, which is centered directly through her hairline. This gives me a reference point where I have a lot of important information that goes through that plumb line. I also have that plumb line drawn on my paper with a pretty dark pencil. This location is not going to move, so it's a really reliable landmark for me to reference in my original reference. And so the next thing I'm going to do before I get started is decide on a second non-negotiable, which is going to be my up and down non-negotiable. That will be, again, hopefully through a very important place, which will give me good reference. I could use the shoulders. I could use information like the top of the finger. I could use some eyebrows, anything that's going to give me an easy point for me to double check measurements up and down with. I'm going to choose this point right here because I think it's going to relate in a certain way to the nose and the hair over here. If this was full site size where I was doing all my measuring from a distance, I'd want something that's very easily visually noticeable. So I can take measurements off that. So my easel is plumb, meaning level. So what I'm going to be doing is taking that reference point of the top of the finger, using my level, and creating my second non-negotiable line. So this is going to give me reference for any locations of lines and shapes in this general area in relationship to here. And so what I can also notice is how the nose relates to that line and the hair. So here, where the hair meets the face, it's just slightly above that point. So when I go to draw part of the hair, I know where to stop it because it relates to this non-negotiable. So these two lines are non-changing. They're absolutely wonderful, and they are my best friends when I'm drawing site size. So I start my drawings with a whole bunch of sharpened pencils. I don't want to have to stop what I'm doing and sharpen along the way. I also like to use these clicky erasers, but I'll also use a kneaded eraser. So to get started, I also have a skewer, and I will also have a plumb line. So a plumb line is simply a heavy weight at the bottom of a string. This will give me alignments this way, but also alignments this way. So this is doing this directly off the drawing, but if I was doing site size standing back, this would help me to see what aligns with what. And my skewer, again, if I'm doing site size from the flat, I have the ability to measure right off of it. But if I was doing site size, let's pretend I'm doing site size, I'd be at a distance. So I'd have to physically mark the height of the head here and check it over here. Again, that's if I'm doing that at a distance. The distance I'm working at right here is only a couple feet, but full site size, you're likely going to be about 6 feet to 8 feet back, depending on the size of your subject. And so, as you can see, going from a distance, our hands are a little shaky, our arms are not perfectly steady, and we can only focus on either this or that. So at an even further distance, we are going to have a range of inaccuracy that we don't have when measuring from the flat. So this is a lot more accurate. And this is also why I encourage people to test out what that feels like when you're measuring at a distance. Because if we rely too heavily on our measurements, we're not going to be training our eyes. Our number one tool is our eyes. So to get started, I'm just going to find some of the most easiest landmarks and things for me to find. So I'll probably start with some larger measurements, some locations of some major elements, some easy things to find. And I mostly start with straight horizontal or vertical marks, and then I'll start to pare that information down or articulate it to create a larger simplified information. To start, I'm going to ignore the eyes and probably focus on these darker eye socket areas. Also, sometimes we call those sometimes the sunglasses. And major shadow shapes, major structural elements, and anything that's easy to see. We're going to start with easy to see things first. So I will be measuring and taking measurements and alignments directly off of it, but keep in mind if you're doing full sight size, you will also be doing these measurements from a distance, which are much more inaccurate, but still just as helpful. So again, distance, you won't be able to focus on that. You have a larger margin of error, but you can still check that information. So I can measure to start, or I can just use my eyeballs. Now I want my eyeballs to be my main tool here. So I could visually approximate the top of that head. I don't have to measure it. This is a ghosty bandy line. So the first thing I'm gonna do is step back and look. Does this look like the same distance? Does this look like that aligns? I want my eyes to be the first thing that determine that. Because of the inaccuracy of full sight size, I'm trying to train my vision. So visually looking, that looks about right. It maybe looks a little high, but we can double check that with measuring. So here I'm measuring to the fact that this is where my plum is. So I'm approximating where I feel that non-negotiable is. I'm putting the tip over there, my thumbnail where I believe the non-negotiable crosses. And then I'm going to check over here. And I've been working in sight size for a very long time, so that's actually quite accurate. My eye is pretty accurate. If you find you're off by about an inch, then that's a pretty big distance, but your eye should be able to tell you that. Again, the more practice you have doing sight size, the more accurate your eye will become, which is why that started out pretty accurate. So again, we're going to try to approximate that distance. I'm not going to measure it to start. And I think that the outside of her head is maybe about here. Again, ghosty bandy lines. I want these easy to erase, easy to adjust. Single lines. I don't want a big hairy fat line. I want something nice and easy for my eyes to take a look at. Now, looking at this distance versus that one, I think this is too thin. So my eyes are telling me that if I flick my eyes back and forth, this looks wider than that. So let's test that. So I have to close one eye, so I only see one version of this measurement. And okay. Again, we're actually quite spot on. Visually, this actually looks a little bit wider, but the way it measures, it's actually measuring pretty good. Again, I've been doing sight size for almost 8 years now, so my approximations have gotten more and more accurate. All right, so then we can kind of do the same thing. This seems larger than that, so we're gonna approximate that just by eye. So again, a ghosty bandy line, single mark. And so we're going to test from up here, but again, if this is sight size, I could do this and then double check that. So you can see that the measurements are a little wobbly, not super reliable. That's why we want to step back and look. Our looking is our first measurement, our first assessment. When we're doing a portrait from life, we can't go up to the model and start measuring right off their face. That would be silly. So we want to make sure that if we are doing a portrait from a distance, that we have a ballpark measurement, but also that our eyes are telling us that things look similar. So let's double check this. And that seems too big. So I can compare, it seems like it should be more like here. So here's the new line. Let's get rid of the old one. Again, we want that easy. The sharp pencil will keep your lines thin and clean and also easy to erase. We don't want any ghosts left behind so that it'll clog up our vision or distract us. So we just want clean, clear marks. So we can now check this in two ways. We can check here to here and we can check here to here. Both of those measurements should work. So from a distance, those measurements should work. That should equal that. And also up close, this, I'm trying to go to the furthest part out from on the hair, should equal that. And that is working. Okay, so maybe the next thing I want to do is start to maybe place in some of this information. I could also start to grab some of the internal face information. Again, I'm mostly sticking with top to bottom locations. I could also find maybe where the peak of the hairline is starting, or where things, you know, certain things cross the, like where the lips cross the plumb line, but I want to try to grab major things. So here's the bottom of the face. That might be a good location to find. So again, I can use measurements to start. I could use my eye and approximate it and make a mark. So let's do that. Let's just make a mark. We're thinking it's a few inches lower than our non-negotiable. We know the non-negotiable kind of goes through here, so we approximate visually where that's going to be. The beginning is very slow. The more time that you spend at the beginning visually testing these are hypotheses. The more time you spend testing them and double checking them, the more accurate you're going to be and the faster the later stages are going to go. So I'm trying to find the place where the face meets the hand. And that's just a location, okay? So what I can do now is I can check the alignment. So in order for me to check the alignment, I can make sure it's parallel with this horizontal here. So there's my line, and it might be a little low. So I can not only check that, but I can also double check the overall height, which I already have a mark for, which I trust because I measured it off of this. Or I could approximate here to here. So let's try a couple of those. Let's do our full height first. Up and down measurements, you don't have to close one eye because you don't have the change in perspective of your measurement. So measuring this, you can see that this should be a little bit higher than my theory. So I think this is what it should be. So let's just test that again. Actually, I think I could split the difference there. Now it's kind of a fuzzy area where that happens, but yeah, I think it can be a little bit lower. So now I want to make sure I erase my old lines. If you don't get it right the first time, that's okay. We're not meant to be robots. We're meant to be humans, which means we are going to, our first few marks are not always going to be perfect. Again, this is about being able to put some marks down and visually assess, and then make changes based on those assessments. So here, this is supposedly where that is, so I can also check here to here, and I can also double check again, and I can also do my plumb line. So this is at a distance, and then this is close up. So that feels pretty good. Okay, so the nice thing here, we have the wrist that's coming, you know, about 1/2 inch off the plum. So there's really no need to measure that. I can kind of block that in. So I know that this is gonna meet, so this, I'm kind of blocking in this line and where it meets up with the chin there. So I'm gonna visually look and say, do I feel like this has enough space for that? And I think that's working for now. So what I did is I assumed, I just did a summary, a simplification of this all the way up. Okay, I think I'll measure this part next just to give myself a nice, that's a really visually obvious location. So I'm just gonna give myself a horizontal for that piece right there. So I can measure from here to here, I can measure from here to here, or I can measure from here to here. Now I don't know if this is long enough for that. So I'll just go off my non-negotiable there. These straight lines are simplifications. They're not meant to be final information. All right, so when I make this mark, it's gonna be out in the middle of nowhere. Could be wrong. I don't really have anything to reference yet in this area. That's working. And I can also double check that. So both of those things are working. Okay, so what I might want to do is, so I know that this is really close to that non-negotiable. So maybe I want to try to find out where the side of the face happens and start to maybe approximate some of the boundaries of the face. So again, I know this distance. I think about the division between the hair and the face. So I can visually assess kind of how wide that is. And that actually should be a little bit lower. So the nice thing about these ghosty bandy lines is you can continue them. I'm mostly shooting for the kind of widest part of that face. That's working pretty good. All right, so I definitely started these lines pretty far up. I don't know if I need that part because we do start making a jog in to the right up towards the top. If I think about where my non-negotiable is and where this plane change starts to happen going this way, it's definitely down further. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit. So I'm going to try to actually get a little bit of that information in because that also gives me some information in relationship to these little hair nubs. So maybe I'm not going to measure directly to the peak of this. I'm going to maybe find where this arc would kind of end right about here. What's nice is it's right on that plumb line. So I can also double check this. Again, I'm not measuring to a very specific place. I'm giving myself an approximation of where that hairline starts and stops. I'm standing back and looking, and I'm looking for like, what's the next most obvious thing I can pull off of this? So the first thing I might do is just give myself a little bit of, so if this is kind of where my hairline's happening, I want to place something down for that angle of her hair. Now there's nothing I can really measure there. I'm just trying to give myself a little bit of information to start building some shapes. What's really nice is we have kind of an abstract shape that we can look at with the plum here, also over here. Okay, so again, we talked about how the plane change here from the cheekbone peak down is slightly above about an inch above the non-negotiable here. So what I'm going to do is give myself a rough estimation of that. Now, you know, sometimes I rehearse and then go in for a landing, and then I'm going to step back and take a look at that statement to see how I feel about it. Now, I want to make sure it's headed towards this point here, which I think it does. That doesn't mean I need to connect it right away. I'm just giving myself a few first marks to make sure I feel like I'm heading in the right direction. So again, we also know that this is roughly about where the non-negotiable is. So I could start to build the hair off of here as well. So again, this is my kind of outermost point. I'm going to bring that down a little bit. And I know as we come off from the cheek, I need a little bit of a push to the left. So I'm going to start that right around where that non-negotiable is. Now that angle feels a little flat, but I'm just going to kind of keep it there to give me some locations, or just give me a feel for maybe where that hair is going to be. I also think, actually I'm going to erase that. Don't be afraid to simplify. Restate that non-negotiable. And I think I actually want to arc this line. So I'm using straight lines, but I think I want to arc this line a little bit more for that cheekbone. I think it's cutting off her cheekbone too early. So I want to push this out a little bit. And because our eye is our major tool, I want to make sure that I keep things clean and tidy so that when I'm making visual assessments to things, I don't have things complicating my view. And I like to have these tails coming off of things where lines meet, because it gives me some extra ability, some extra flexibility there. What I can also do is approximate where this should hit off the non-negotiable. That can also help me a little bit. And that's working pretty good. So maybe let's also place some information for the peak of the brows. I think that'll help a little bit. Again, if I'm doing distance non-negotiable, I do that here, or distance alignment, that would be over here, or I could do it directly off. Or I can eyeball first and make the mark. Let's do that first. So we're dividing this space. Eyebrows are higher than halfway, and we can also think about where those hit the where those hit the plum. So let's go for about here. I'm doing it at a slightly downward slant because that's what the eyebrow looks like. I could also do just a horizontal slant, but actually maybe a horizontal slant would be better. Or horizontal, it wouldn't be a slant, a horizontal line. So I'm trying to think, I'm trying to find kind of maybe the resting point here, that kind of flatness that I'm seeing. There's a little bit of a slant to the peak. So let's go peak of the head to the eyebrow. Yeah, that's pretty good. I could also do kind of peak of the brow to the chin. And that's working too. Now, do the eyebrows align with each other? That's a good question. Or is one slightly higher? They're about the same. So now I have, if this is my eyebrow, I kind of feel like I could now that I know the location, I might want to actually slant it a little bit. All right, so now I have this nice, like easier abstract shape that I can start to play with. Now, here we have this is the furthest point out. We measured our kind of furthest point to the cheek. Now our brow bone's actually at a slight angle in. So what I wanna do is just remember to take that into account when I'm starting to make these shapes. Now I do think that this might actually move a little bit. So I'm gonna try to do a little bit of that. So you can see I'm trying to make this 1, 2, 3, 4 shape work. So let's see, we can measure the end of that point, or we can just kind of move on and see if we can start to build some other things that can help us out. Let's do that. Our nose shadow shape, the bedbug line ends about here. It's kind of a similar distance that we had down here. So I'm just going to mark the shadow shape line for the nose right in the center of the face, the distance from there. Again, easy peasy. Look for the easy stuff. We can find where the plane changes happen here because we have a pretty good value difference where the keystone starts to happen. So I might actually mark where that keystone happens. It's not a shadow, but it is a major structural division point, so that might actually help me a little bit. So I could just visually put that in. That needs to be a lot lower. That seems kind of low. Oh, I guess not. Okay. So that gives me a little bit of information. I do think, let's see, this maybe seems a little wide. Again, the more changes and the more time that you spend in these early stages, it's going to help a lot later. Now my pencil's starting to get a little dull. I could change to a new pencil or sharpen it. I find that the duller my pencil get, the darker my lines get, and I don't want that. So here I'm just going to approximate that line where the keystone breaks that information. Now, what I can also do is let's get a width for that spot here. And then again, we've got a major plane change this way and then a major plane change that way. So I'm going to simplify this into 1, 2, 3. And I don't want to develop any one section until I get something in for everything. So if this is here, and then I need to have, I know this is going to hit the plumb line here. So this is an easy point to measure. This is like a corner to grab onto, so I could easily measure that. So I know that this is going to kind of come off here like this. It's going to cross that plumb line. So this has more of a, it's like, it's sometimes awkward to get to certain spaces to draw. So I'm going to use the arc of my wrist to give a little bit of a curvature here. And then this plane change, where that happens. Let's see, it's right about there. And sometimes you gotta throw something down to take a look and assess to see what's happening. So here I can start to actually just analyze this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, actually I have 3, 4. That simple shape. If it's feeling too fat, reassess the width. If it's feeling too tall, reassess the height. If I feel like this plane change is happening in a drastically different location, assess some of the angles. So this, sometimes it's just changing this line, sometimes it's just changing the angle of that, but there's all types of ways that you can adjust that shape. What's really nice is I have the exact non-negotiable directly below this brow. So that needs to go up. I think that whole line needs to shift up. I think the fingers are very easy horizontal to start blocking in as well. We know it's inside the hair, outside of the face, so we could also approximate it. We know it has to be inside from here and outside from here, so it has to be in the middle. Maybe I'm a little premature with this one. Don't be afraid to simplify. Not angled enough. So now I'm trying to think about the distance from the hair, which I know is on the non-negotiable, and the start of the neck. Now this is a pretty fuzzy line, so I just want to get the approximation of it. I think it's too long. Restate that line and let's start there. Let's go there. If there's anything visually getting in the way of what it looks like, maybe pull back on some of these landmarks. So these points are also really hard because they're far away from the plum and there's not a lot of stuff to measure from. So that's where sometimes using alignments can help. So if I look at the kind of top part of the shoulder, it's slightly below where the chin is meeting the hand. So I could approximate where that shoulder is going to end up based on this location. And I can also use my alignment. It's a pretty far distance and I have a short string, so I'm just going to use that. So we'll probably simplify 1, 2, 3, 4. I do think this angle could be a little bit wider, so let's do that. That does not look right. If it doesn't look right, trust your eyes. All right, let's maybe think about maybe where this collarbone is. That might help a little bit better. So what I can do is go from brow to kind of the approximate top of the collarbone. Sometimes some of that physical information can help. That's a pretty horizontal line there. It's relatively horizontal. Okay, that also gives me this kind of triangle to take stock of. That's a better approximation. So I'm getting a little bit of a hairy line in here. So I'm gonna make sure I get my gummy eraser out and thin it out. We don't want it to be multiple lines that we're trying to visually assess. So now I'm just gonna work around to start piecing together parts of the whole. Visually looking. How far out does that look from here? Too far. I always go back and double check some of my early measurements just in case they're feeling off to me. No, that's still feeling pretty good. This cuts off, this little segment stops slightly below that, so I can approximate that. So everything's an approximation. This is not about being perfect from the beginning. This is about roughing things in a simplified way, and then starting to find corrections and adjustments along the way. Peak of this little ribbon thing, this is actually below that. So once you start to have stuff down, it's less about actually measuring and starting to build relationships, and that's going to come into play really strongly when you're doing full site size and your measurements are super inaccurate. So we can get to a very accurate place very quickly using measuring off the flat. But if you're doing full site size, these measurements can often just be really, up to about 1/4 of an inch, sometimes 1/2 inch off. But that's what, using the BARGs to train your vision will make you more sensitive and make the information more correct from the beginning. So as if I want to try to close this off, what I can do is think about how tall this segment is and how far this is from the plum. So I'm going to be thinking about the connection point here and the connection point here. So I kind of want to I want a short connection point here and a longer connection here. So and I'm also just thinking about the general angle. And I'm going to step back and look. And do I feel like that's wide enough? Do I feel like that's tall enough? Do I feel like things are going to align? And then I can use my tools to double check that. Even connection points. This might be able to go out a little bit further. right, let's move down into this area. I don't have a ton going on with the hand. So here's our finger, the top of this finger here, the outside of that finger here. So we know, let's maybe get some information in down here. So here's a summary of that. We can approximate this distance. So I can also think about 1, 2, 3, 4, this 4-sided shape, and I want something similar over here. That'll work for now. I can also think of this kind of V shape if I want to think about where this finger maybe starts to block in. I can also measure from the plum. Oh, that looks like it should be a lot further over. That means I want to double check the plum to the face because that seems smaller than I want it to be, but it could just be an angle. Okay, yeah, it should be a little bit over here. If you lose your non-negotiable, try to restate it. Now this is a curved line, but I'm not worried too much about the curvature of it. I can even just erase those lines just to keep it open. But I want to just get everything blocked in before I commit to anything. You can see the change of direction here as it starts to swoop this way. It happens slightly above this mark. Now this is not technically a straight line, but it's a straight enough line for the arc. The arc of my wrist makes a pretty decent straight line. I'd still call that straight. So here I'm going to be looking at I'm going to be approximating the width of this hand here. Now there's not really much I can grab onto or measure, but just making sure I look at the width here, where the trajectory is, how it meets up in other places will help me to figure out if it's correct or not. So I'm trying to just approximate that. That's an easy point to measure and to check. So I do know it has to go through that point. So number one, I can see how low it is compared to the plum. So it's about, 2 or so inches down. So I could also give myself a little bit of a help that way. I could also see how it relates to the chin where the chin meets the hand, which is, it's just a tiny bit higher. So that one's actually a little bit easier. So no measuring really needed for that. I can also check relationships here to here, check relationships here to here. And I can also see alignment-wise, the side of the hair. If I drop a plum, it's almost in the same location. So I could use that alignment to say, oh, the hand has to go through this point. I don't like that angle. So if I know that pivot point, I can just pivot lines through that point. And if I just want to double check up here, it's a little fuzzy, so it's hard to check, but you can still come up and physically measure it. That actually feels like it should go out a little bit farther, but we'll check. So this is allowing me to just double check where these points are. So I'll be able to get to a much more accurate place faster than if this was true full site size, then I would have eventually found that information, but it would just take more breakdown for me to find that something needed to be adjusted. What I can also do is approximate where this comes off the plum. So I think maybe maybe this can come down a little bit. This is maybe feeling a little wide, but also perhaps not. So I'm also looking at this width versus that width, which should be a lot wider. So I'm stepping back and thinking that the wrist maybe feels a bit wide. So I'm just going to visually adjust. This is higher than that one. I'm getting that this actually needs to be a little bit further out. So I think part of the reason is this needs to be slanted outwards. I'm getting the overarching outside of this should be out here a bit more. So just because I put a line down and I leave it and I work with it doesn't mean it's totally perfect. I'm always open to suspicion. So then I'm thinking about that versus that, and if it's too long or too short. And also its relationship to the brow. So I can also think about the trajectory of that back thing. I could also visually, I'm going to start to block in maybe the Superman shape of the eye sockets. So I can, first of all, just approximate this distance from the non-negotiable. Shadow shape. This is going to be the shadow shape, part of the shadow shape here. I will likely include parts of this as the shadow shape, maybe even this whole, I know this is halftone, but I might include it. This is a really easy thing to take note of. I'm going to get a new pencil because mine is getting dull. one shoulder is slightly lower than the other one. I can also try to take note of the negative space shaping, which I keep having to raise this up to make it work. That's too high. Also, when you're working from the flat, a really easy reference point is the complete edge of the image. This is not something that you can do if you're working from life. In a way, you kind of have three plums because you know the sides of your image are not going to move either. I don't always like to depend on those, especially when I'm going to be going beyond the reference. So sometimes I'll take reference image of, like, let's say a self-portrait or something else, and I'll actually kind of invent beyond that, and I might need additional information. So I don't always mark the ends of it, but it is a way to kind of keep things in check. The top of the bracelets. That kind of works out. You can kind of see how that works. That distance is working. I'm going to bring this in a little bit. don't want to get too detailed. I want to get more general information in. At the bottom of the nose, so the nose is not centered on that plumb line. So I feel like the bottom of the nose is about there. Maybe that's a little low. Outside of the nose is just outside here. Center of the nose is about here. Shadow shape width is maybe about there. Nope. This is okay. So I want to just try to go for the shadow shape here. I don't want to get too caught up in details. So again, I'm going to use this as a reference. This is a major plane change here. And we can tell because there's a value shift. So you're usually going to associate value shifts with plane changes for shapes. These pretty much align, so we can give ourselves some added info there. So when I'm standing back and just looking, I'm bouncing my eyes all over the drawing to see, and flicking my eyes back and forth to see if there's anything that I can see that's feeling off. I'm not committed to any of this information. The simplicity of it and the ease of erasing it is actually quite important. And this is even more so the case when you're working from life and you don't have the ability to measure from the flat. Measuring from the flat and working from the flat can really help to train your vision really well so that this becomes much easier for you to work with. So I think I'm just going to simplify this as 1, 2, 1, 2, so that I don't get caught up into that shadow shape too much. This is where sometimes using the harder eraser to clean up information helps. My chin's a pretty easy thing to see, so let's approximate that. Go back to larger measurements tend to be a little bit more accurate, so it's always a great thing to come back to. And that's working. The tendency is always going to be to go straight for those eyes, but if you can try to see past those details, if we get the larger forms right, those eyes are going to be a lot easier. Here I'm going for the center line. So I'm trying to think about this relationship to this relationship. I'm trying to ignore the outer boundaries to start because I find that the center of the lips is easier to see. And then I think it's too high if I compare it to the relationship of the chin. And then once I have that information, and then I can worry about trying to get other information. But again, I'll leave that for later. Part of me thinks that this shoulder needs to go up. trying to visually approximate that distance and the angle. So what's hard about measuring for any of this is there's not really great things to latch onto. So this is really mostly has to be by eye. And that's why it's important to have some things that you can trust to some degree. So what I could also do is say, okay, well, if this is my plumb line, or if this is my non-negotiable, this ends slightly above that. So we can kind of approximate where that's happening. All right, we can use our plumb line here. All right, and then I could measure from here to here. That would give me a better idea of where that should be. Let's see, let's test how close I am. That needs to be a little bit higher. So new information can sometimes give us shed some light on the fact that some of our information could be adjusted, our early information could be adjusted. So I'm, again, getting that shoulder can come up a little bit more. That's the worst sound. Broken pencil. Another reason why it's good to have a bunch of pencils sharpened. That's better. Also working from the flat, another way you can kind of quote unquote cheat, or also known as speed up the process, is those edges. I'm just going to do that just to help myself out. If it makes your life easier, why not? There's no rules, there's no cheating in getting work done. And this is working from the flat can be so much easier to find information quickly. The job we're doing with our cartoon, the job we're doing with our drawing, the main purpose is to gather information. It's not just to get a perfect drawing. Even as I bring this into a painting, I'm always going to be assessing drawing information. So this is not about getting a perfect drawing ready for transfer so that I never have to think about drawing again. This is about information gathering and about familiarity with the subject. My painting is always going to adjust the drawing to some degree, but this is going to get me in a really accurate ballpark, and I'm going to feel comfortable and familiar with the shapes and relationships, and that makes painting a lot easier because I can keep track of drawing adjustments as I go. So in the same way that you could also be doing this as a painting, so you could be blocking this in using paint in a linear fashion, but usually people get to masses a lot sooner than they would if they were using pencil. All right, so I'm going to switch over to a different pencil because this one is getting kind of dull. So it's a little bit hard to see my plumb line down here, but it goes right past here. It goes right to the side of this little flower thing. I do find that the things that are furthest away from your non-negotiables are going to have the most inaccuracies. Just kind of keep an eye on that. So here I'm going to start to break down larger information into smaller information. This is what we call articulation. Still using straight lines though. So I'm looking for all the separate plane changes. So I originally had this as 1, 2, and the next thing I'm going to do is break it down into 1, 2, 3. And so now I'm going to start to really focus on those medium shapes. Even the width of a pencil line can make a difference. Always going in and cleaning up so I can see what I'm saying. I'm thinking about the relationship here as this kind of pushes down, the trajectory of this hits that over here. So I want to make sure that I'm getting a similar read in my drawing. I'm actually going to bring this wrist in just a little bit. It's feeling a little wide. And so again, that pencil width can actually make a difference. I want to make sure I don't equalize it too much. I want to make sure that there's still a plane change there. So I want to just clarify a little bit that there's a plane change. That might be a little overstated. So this is when, as I start to make these corrections, I have a tendency to get darker, and that'll also happen if your pencil starts to dull. So it's possible that I just need to lighten up a little bit or sharpen my pencil. I also want to make sure that visually these things are also connecting, because this clavicle is what creates this and then up into here. I'm thinking of this kind of bow tie shape here, making sure that that's working over here. And I was noticing that I was looking to cut off the pinky, and I was noticing that the distance between the lip and the hand was a little thin, so I'm trying to work that out. It also thins out the hand, which is good. I'm trying to think about how the shadow falls over the forearms. That can really help for me to inform me about the way that this finger is ending and then this shadow's wrapping around. So I'm trying to find this light shape. Again, trying to see past all the details, trying to see past my assumptions about what I'm drawing. Trying to mostly see structure. Where are those plane changes? So a lot of what I'm doing now is very minimal measuring, because all the work I've done from the beginning I can use as almost a framework for adding on additional information. dull. It's a shadow shape. You can start to build some of this information. It's a little bit lower than that change of direction, but I can also compare it to here. And I can also compare it to here, which is about the same. Same thing over here. So this is half tone, but because when I squint down, it kind of groups as a shape, I might just block it in as a full shape. This ends lower than that. So the tendency is always to go for those details, but as long as I have this shape accurate, I could actually leave them out of the cartoon. I might make some landmark notations for certain areas, but I likely won't go into getting all the details in the eyes. I'm going to see how far I can get with these linear statements before I think about even considering filling in shadow shapes. So I want to draw the group of the bracelets, not individual bracelets. Maybe a little wide. Yeah. So a lot of this is being done by eye. The lips can go up a little bit. I'm not going to put in full shapes for these things. I just want to put a few landmarks. This is the type of information I'd likely try to find in my first pass of paint. It's very organic and ambiguous, so I'm not going to try to find everything. I might just give myself a few landmarks so that I can have at least a starting point for when I start to block this in paint. So these are just kind of landmarks. But I'm not going to do probably entire shadow shapes for it. You know, maybe for some really high contrast areas, I could stand to block some things in. Sometimes finding this information is a little bit easier, more easily done with masses. pencil's starting to get dull, so I need to switch to a sharper one or sharpen it. So now typically this would be the extent at which I would do a drawing for transfer for a painting. I will sometimes fill in the shadow shapes when I feel it's necessary, which is what I'm going to move forward and articulate this a little bit more and also fill in some shadow shapes in order to see if I can correct the drawing a little bit more. But this level of simplification is actually pretty close to what I would normally transfer for a painting. And then I would find even more detailed information with paint in the different stages of painting. The first stage is very simple, so I wouldn't get into details in the first stage. But the second stage of painting is where I would really find all the information using paint. This would be enough for one of my typical paintings, but because I'm doing this for a class and a demonstration piece, I'm going to take this a little bit further and then also bring it to a cartoon and use some masses and shadows, shadow shapes in order to confirm or adjust the drawing additionally. The stage goes a lot easier if you've spent the time in those early stages. Mm. So here the area that's most obvious to me is the larger shadow shape underneath it. So I'm almost grouping the top of the lid with the eyeball. And I can leave that a little bit ambiguous too. A lot of this is just gonna be masked in as a single value with maybe a little bit of information with one other value when I do get to paint. Mm-mm. Okay, so at this point for the face, I think I'm going to start to fill in some shadow shapes so that I can start to see a little bit more past this. I feel pretty comfortable with the drawing here, and I think it's ready for transfer. A lot of the other information that I don't need to fill in the shadow shapes for, I can find with paint in my first or second layers. So here's what we call the cartoon. Shadow shapes are filled in, still structural, still linear in a way, but really most of the drawing has been thought out, and I'm extremely familiar with the shapes, so I feel confident going to the canvas with this.